So welcome back to another episode, and we're going to be continuing our discussion of legitimation crisis. And tonight, I want to focus on the concept of crisis itself, particularly as Habermas discusses it in the opening chapter of his book, Legitimation Crisis. And what I want to bring out is a systematic approach, an approach that Habermas introduces from a sociologist named Talcott Parsons that can be used to understand society, a way of understanding society as a system and a framework within which you can understand what it means when that system comes into crisis. And using those analytical tools, perhaps we can look at some of the events going on around us today and try to decide whether and to what extent they pose real crises or whether we are on our way to a social crisis and how those occur. So perhaps the best place to begin is with the first sentence of the book. And that sentence reads as follows. To use the expression, quote, late capitalism, unquote, is to put forward the hypothesis that even in state-regulated capitalism, social developments involve contradictions or crises. I shall therefore begin by elucidating the concept of crisis. So, first thing to comment on here is that in this sentence, Habermas is in fact explaining in a very simple way what is meant by the expression late capitalism, which is, as I've said in the past, it involves the idea that our current capitalist system that has grown up in Western democracies since the 18th century, has reached a point where we are being hit with periodic crises, and we have a governmental system whose role is to try to manage those crises. So we have, as an underlayer of society, an economic system. It's a capitalist system. And then above that, you could say, we have a governmental structure, an administrative structure that is trying to maintain the basic conditions for that society to function. So we have things like regulations. We have the Federal Reserve that attempts to smooth out the ups and downs in the business cycle. And we have educational policies, environmental policies, etc. And all these efforts by the government are really there to try to maintain a kind of homeostasis within society. So another thing that I can bring in here that I think would help the overall comprehension of the reading is the idea of a feedback loop, um, the idea of a control mechanism that works together with feedback mechanisms. It was sometimes packaged in an overall framework called Cybernetics. And probably the easiest way to begin to discuss what cybernetics was all about, the cybernetics movement, is that the word cybernetics was formulated not with the idea of like cyborgs or anything computer related in mind, and all that came later. But the term itself goes back to the Greek word Kubernetes. So the Greek word starts with a kappa, Kubernetes, and that later became the Latin word for governor. So you can hear, if you go from the K to the G, Kubernetes, it almost sounds like governor in a way. But the Greek word there, Kubernetes, means steersman. And the idea is that in biological systems and in mechanized systems, if you have a control mechanism that can make adjustments based upon the feedback, based upon the information that is fed to that control mechanism, the control mechanism can make adjustments in the system that allow it to maintain a certain level of functioning. So an example would be something like the thermostat inside of a car. Okay, and I'll explain how this is. I think it's pretty simple for anybody out there who isn't familiar with thermostats in cars. So what it looks like is kind of like a top, except underneath you have a spring. And the way that it functions is there's a part on top of the spring that sets into a seal, a rubber seal. And inside of the main housing that the spring goes around, there is some wax. And when the liquid is heated up around the thermostat, that wax begins to expand. There are actual pellets of wax inside that main post, that main central post that you could visualize as being the main axis of a spinning top. Okay, and inside that's where these pellets of wax are. And when the liquid around the thermostat heats up, the wax starts to melt, and the thermostat begins to open up. So that spring, which is there to provide a little bit of pressure to open the thermostat up, allows that top part to come up and allow the liquid to flow through. And when the liquid flows through, that opens up a second part of the system. That liquid then begins to go to the radiator. The radiator has some coolant in it, and then that comes back into the system as cooler liquid. So what you have is a system that first works on one circuit, and then when it needs to maintain its temperature, once that wax begins to melt, and they figure out exactly how much wax and composition and everything so that the thermostat will begin to open up once it reaches a certain temperature, the thermostat opens up, and then another cycle, another loop is created. So the liquid flows out, comes back as cool liquid, and then once the liquid is cool enough, the wax begins to cool down, and instead of expanding, it starts to contract, and then the thermostat begins to close. So what you have in that system is a control that's based upon trying to maintain a homeostasis, a certain level of temperature inside the car, just like the body is trying to maintain a certain level of temperature or of blood sugar or pH or something like that. But what's important to recognize are just the basic elements. There's something that acts like a sensor, okay? there's something that acts as a control mechanism for maintaining the functioning of the overall system. And it's able to return itself to an optimum point by utilizing its mechanism of control. Okay. So one other detail I'll bring in is just with that word stasis. The word stasis in Greek can be understood in two different ways. Stasis can mean a kind of standing, but it can also refer to the idea of a conflict. So that, I think, nicely illustrates exactly what type of role these control mechanisms are actually trying to perform. There's an opposition between hot and cold, and their purpose is to try to regulate that opposition. So it's homeo, meaning one or the same, trying to maintain a continuity, with stasis, which you could think of as either a kind of a stable situation, a situation where things are brought to a certain stand, or as a conflict between two things. So this is all meant to elucidate the idea that there are control mechanisms that you could say are built into the way that our government works. And this thinking really got going around the time when cybernetics began to become more popular. It started filtering into discussions of sociology. And you can see it in Habermas's use of the term steering mechanisms that comes up pretty frequently in legitimation crisis. It looks to me as very likely that the term steering mechanism probably is meant to echo the basic idea of cybernetics, which goes back to the Greek word for the steersman of a ship. And what government is trying to do, what the political structure in a late capitalist society is meant to do, is really to try to regulate society so that the engine of capitalism can function at an optimum level. And that means, as I think I have been mentioning, as I mentioned earlier, it involves all different aspects of society. It involves negative externalities that industry within a capitalist society creates. So negative externalities are things like the pollution that's created by a paper mill. Something has to be done with various forms of waste that are environmentally dangerous. They can contaminate the soil, the water, etc., the air. And usually it's governments that end up doing that. Or else there are government agencies that are set up to regulate those things, laws that are passed so that those negative externalities don't threaten society as a whole, which would in turn undermine the capitalist system to a certain extent. So it's in things like regulation, it's in things like the laws that are made, it's in things like trying to improve the public school system so that when people get ready to go and join the workforce, they'll have the skills and education that they need in order to make a positive contribution. But the perspective that the term late capitalism involves, first of all, involves the idea of crisis, that returning to the thermostat analogy, we're always in a state where the government is trying to regulate and manage. And there's the business cycle. There are intermittent crises and things that have to be managed all the time. And the role of government is to manage them. the function of capitalist society can be compared to the engine that government wants to try to keep running smoothly. Okay, so returning to the rest of this, to use the expression late capitalism is to put forward the hypothesis that even in state regulated capitalism, that is, despite the best efforts of the government that is trying to regulate, just like the thermostat, possible crises and difficulties that arise, social developments involve contradictions or crises. Okay, and he says, I shall therefore begin by elucidating the concept of crisis. And what he's going to do is make an argument in the rest of this part one of chapter one that is in favor of looking at society from a certain perspective. This is a perspective that, as I think I mentioned earlier, was formulated by Talcott Parsons. And basically, what Habermas wants to do is he wants to say that when we think of society, we can't just think of it as a system that's responding just to external crises, like a biological organism that just has to try to maintain its internal world in the face of external forces, whatever they might be, like a body that has to maintain the right level of salt inside of its blood and try to do things so that what goes into it doesn't affect its state of internal well-being. But you also have to think about the internal elements, not just the external forces that might cause difficulties for a society, but also the internal elements. And this is the strength of Parsons' way of looking at society. So perhaps the best thing to do is to just dive right into exactly what that Parsonsian, I guess, I don't know, structure actually is. And it can be broken down into an acronym. I've seen AGIL, but I've also seen GAIL. I think GAIL is a little bit more memorable. And the letters stand for G, goal-orientedness, A, adaptation, I, integration, and L, latent pattern maintenance. So if we go through each one of those, I think the point that I'm trying to make about what Habermas is saying will come out a little bit more clearly. So goal-orientedness is, you could think of it as goals that politicians or the government sets for society. I think it's more or less self-explanatory. It's sometimes spoken of with reference to maintaining a certain level of income, well-being, what have you. But it could also be thought of as something grander, like let's try to go to the moon or something like that. Okay, the next letter, A, adaptation, goes hand in hand with goal-orientedness. And adaptation can also have a couple of different senses to it. Adaptation can be thought of in a positive sense, which is the sense that I've read in Parsons, which is just the idea that as you're trying to meet a goal or as you're trying to maintain a certain level of well-being in a society, you want to continually try to refine the processes and methods that are in play in this system, so to speak, that's regulating society, to make it better and better and better. So that might be the educational system. That might mean the way that the Federal Reserve works with the banks. Um, it could mean all sorts of things, getting Congress to work together in a more effective way. It could mean different proposals that people have in Congress, and trying to get those passed, and overcoming the practical hurdles involved. So adaptation could refer to just the idea of getting greater and greater efficiency in doing all those tasks that need to be performed to make government function well, to make society as a whole function well, with the idea of a goal in mind as the point of that adaptation. But it could also mean a response to some kind of difficulty. So, how do we adapt to an oil embargo in the 1970s? What do we do about skyrocketing inflation in the late 70s? How does government respond to those things? Um, and the third level down takes us to the I part, which is integration. And integration, the term probably suggests something like agreement among people about what they're trying to do in a particular scenario, or whether people agree with the goals of society or the company they're working in. And it does seem to have a little bit of that idea attached to it, but the main takeaway that I've got just from looking at Parsons is that it has more to do, and this is something that I also have found in Habermas as well, is that it has more to do with the idea of the interconnectedness of the parts of the mechanism that's supposed to regulate society, and whether those parts are functioning well together. So I think the best way to think about integration is from that functionalist perspective that I discussed a few lectures back. You might recall that whole analogy of the shoe and the four causes, and as a way to illustrate the idea of a functionalist perspective. But the important point there is that there is a goal, okay, and then there are all the different pieces that have to work together to achieve that goal. And when they are working together in an optimal way, then you have an optimal systemic integration. So let's say inside the car engine itself, is the timing mechanism right on the spark plugs? How much oxygen is getting into the cylinders for the spark plugs to fire, and all those sorts of things? Are all the parts working together as they should to produce the optimum result? And then finally, L, which is the fourth rung down, latent pattern maintenance, refers more directly to what people are doing in society in their daily lives, and how people fit into the social structure. So, how is society and the institutions that society develops, like educational systems, how is society preparing and adapting and initiating people into those social roles that they need to fill so that society can meet its goals ultimately? If society has decided that one of our goals is to become a wealthy society, or a society that maximizes quality of life, or a society that has the best healthcare, or whatever those goals are, down at that most basic level, there also needs to be a well functioning way in which people are being prepared to fill the roles that society needs people to play in order to make that system work. So are they getting the right sort of education? Do they feel motivated to fill those roles? When people develop a sense of themselves and their identity, is it easy or is it difficult for them to try to match their sense of self-identity to the roles that they are expected to fill? And it seems to me that this is one of the bigger social problems that we are encountering these days. Is that a lot of people, as they're entering the working world or filling those social roles, don't seem very content with the roles that they are expected to fill. There's a lot of incentive for people to become coders or programmers or managers of this and managers of that. And when people finally respond to those incentives and meet those challenges and go through those years of education, they often wonder if the work was really worth what they had to do to get there. Or they'll face some disillusionment about what those roles that society needs them to fulfill really mean for them personally. And unless that bottom layer of this entire structure is in place, unless there is an actual level of happiness in society as people try to fill those roles, and as opposed to just a pervasive sense of drudgery and pessimism, eventually you're going to have a diminished quality of life, which could lead to a lack of faith in the government, which can lead to the government having to manage society to a greater degree and try to legitimize itself. Okay, and this is my personal take. And what I'm about to say is my own personal way of looking at this, but I think it fits. What I want to suggest is that there's a way in which a crisis or difficulty at the top level can be related to difficulties in a descending order as you go down those levels. So government needs to create goals for society. And as I was saying, those goals need to be goals that people believe in, that people believe have some legitimacy. And government has to be able to respond to different external and internal problems as they arise. Okay, so let's say that in the normal course of events, some sort of problem crops up. What needs to happen? Well, some sort of adaptation needs to occur. So let's say it's September 11th, a major attack on American soil. How does the government respond to it? Well, government ends up adapting. And this is where the adaptation part of this whole scheme fits in. So historically, the way government responded was through more regulation. So now when we go through airports, we go through these screening mechanisms. We have to take off our shoes. And a lot of us might dimly recall the day when you could walk into an airport, put your ticket down, and walk into an airplane. And those days are gone. Department of Homeland Security was created. As I recall, there was a lot more internet surveillance that happened after that time. And so those are all adaptations that occurred following that event. Now, adaptations directly affect societal integration. So, can we now integrate these adaptations in society with the different parts of society as a whole? Okay, well, we have to get people to kind of go along with the program, and there have been little problems with that. We had Edward Snowden come out and reveal the kind of government surveillance that was going on. Um, there has been some discussion about to what extent can we compromise our freedoms, our liberties in society in the face of terrorist threats. There's also the fact that we went to war, and I'm not sure, but I believe the war in Afghanistan is still ongoing. We may have a few troops remaining there. Um, yes, I'm being told that the war in Afghanistan is still going on for sure. You know, I think I read something in the news that Trump was trying to get everybody out before he left office. But I can very well believe that we are still there. So that's another adaptation, but it also involves an amount of integration within society, making the parts of society function well together. And it seems like we have, for the most part, been able to do that. All these parts needing to function well together. Except, I guess you could say that Iraq was, for a few years, looking like a very, very bad situation. And then underneath that layer, we have latent pattern maintenance. So, how has that event um, affected the way that people are being educated? It seems like there's been a lot more emphasis on respecting people from different cultural traditions and that sort of thing. There's been more emphasis on that in the school system and on the news and the media, but at the same time, there are undercurrents in society that seem more xenophobic. So you could say that on the one hand, there has been an effort to try to open people up. On the other hand, there has been a backlash that perhaps you could attribute back to the September 11th attacks to some extent. So the politics of how we view people from other societies as either threats or as people who um, can benefit our society. Um, okay, so I'll certainly be returning to these ideas as we go along because I feel like they're actually almost kind of like an unconscious function as kind of the background, the unconscious latent background of pretty much every page of Legitimation Crisis and probably affects just about everything that Habermas writes. So I don't want to go on for too much longer, but let me just now take a look at a couple more things and I'll close with some of the main ideas from the section. So if we look at page 2, we find Habermas writing, in the social sciences today, a systems theoretic concept of crisis is frequently used. According to this systems approach, crises arise when the structure of a social system allows fewer possibilities for problem solving than are necessary to the continued existence of the system. In this sense, crises are seen as persistent disturbances of system integration. So, from that perspective, from the systems theoretic perspective, The government is out there with its quote unquote steering mechanisms operating at the level of goals and adaptation. And then underneath that, the crises occur in the realm of integration. Can we keep the system together, functioning as one unified whole? Or are those social adaptations um, actually getting in the way of the functioning of society? Something I feel like I should mention just to further elucidate the concept of integration, adaptation, and how those two fit together is that when there is a change in society, sometimes those social changes can be such that society isn't quite able to adapt fully, or the adaptations that need to be made can sometimes threaten the existing social order. So, for example, let's say that in order to in order to have a healthy, functioning capitalist society, we need to break up some large corporations. Let's say it's Microsoft or Intel or somebody who has a lot of power out there, a few of the big players in the banking system. And this can create a crisis, when it involves people who have a lot of power who may not want to give up that power. Um, when you're in a business situation and you have some sort of situation that occurs that threatens someone's power, usually there is a backlash. I mean, when you go to work or something, there's a situation that that occurs where someone's authority, their position is questioned in some way or fashion, and usually there is a backlash to that. And those moments can occur in society, and when they do, when those people end up having to give up their position because their roles are simply not needed anymore, or because they're not performing their roles in a way that benefits society, society nevertheless has to adapt. Society nevertheless has to grow, or else social integration will be threatened. Let's say it's a manager with a very domineering managerial style, and let's just say that in the year 2021, people just aren't responding to that. People will respond better to someone with more of an educational style. The person goes around educating people as opposed to trying to whip them up into being more productive. And so that person falls out of favor. That person has to adapt, just like a social institution would have to adapt, or else it would threaten the integration of society, the functioning of the parts, how well they're working together. And unless that change occurs, unless that adaptation occurs, then society won't be functioning at an optimum level. So, or the business won't be functioning at an optimum level. So that's just another perspective I want to bring in there. And so, continuing, in this sense, crises are seen as persistent disturbances of social integration. So there's that interplay between adaptation and integration. It can be objected against the social scientific usefulness of this concept, that it does not take into account the internal causes of a systemic overloading of control capacities. And just think of the thermostat, its way of controlling, trying to maintain a certain level of, let's say, systemic well-being. It does not take into account the internal causes of a systematic overloading of control capacities. Crises in social systems are not produced through accidental changes in the environment, but through structurally inherent system imperatives that are incompatible and cannot be hierarchically integrated. Structurally inherent contradictions can, of course, be identified only when we are able to specify structures important for a continued existence. So, what Habermas is getting at here is the real crises, the crises that we really need to be concerned about, are the kinds of crises that society can't adapt to. Okay? Because as long as the society is functioning well, it can overcome those obstacles to its goals. It's able to adapt, and in the process of adapting, it can further integrate society in line with those adaptive changes. And then further down the line, people can feel like they have a place in society. Those people who are entering the workforce and filling those roles can maybe feel a sense of genuine achievement, personal fulfillment, those sorts of things as they are filling out those roles in society. But when we get to a point where the basic structure of society itself is such that it cannot meet those challenges, then you have a genuine crisis. So it's not just a problem to be overcome. It's not just a something that needed to be adapted to, but that we were able to get past, like the oil embargo or high inflation in the 1970s. But it's something that threatens the entire functioning of the system itself. That requires a revision of that system. So what Habermas is getting at here is real crises, moments of crisis, that are really something to be concerned about, are crises that threaten the basic identity of a society as a whole. And those could occur, I think, probably at any of those levels. A society that has goals that people in society don't feel are legitimate, or it can't meet those goals, resulting in a legitimacy crisis for the government. Or in the face of our contemporary society, perhaps people who just feel alienated from society, from the standpoint that they just don't feel like the kind of work that they do is fulfilling, or that their life prospects, perhaps because of ongoing social inequality, are really satisfactory. For reasons like that, you could simply say that there are structural problems in society that are not going to be overcome without structural changes. And perhaps this is a place to remind ourselves that Habermas is, in many of his books, he writes from a Marxist standpoint. And there is a Marxist vision of social crisis that Habermas mentions, but says immediately enough has been written about that already. And the Marxist vision of social crisis is simply that the capitalist system eventually is going to have a systemic crisis that will be inevitable, and it will lead to the final phase of history, which is communism. Marx believes that we will be led there because the more and more capitalism, the owners of capital in a capitalist society purchase machines that replace workers, the less and less they will be able to profit by the exploitation of those workers. And so their profits will decline over time, but they'll be driven to purchase more and more of these machines because they're competing with other people in the marketplace for cheaper and cheaper commodities, to sell cheaper and cheaper goods. But the difference between buying a machine and purchasing labor is that a machine has a price tag with it, and you have to pay the full value of the machine. Whereas when somebody goes to work and begins laboring, you could find all sorts of ways to get more out of their labor per hour in terms of their productivity or whatever. So there are all sorts of ways that you can find ways to pay someone less than their actual value, the actual value that they produce for the company. And Marx thinks that that is, in fact, the only way for capitalists to make profit. And that assumption, I think, is one that very few people would take seriously anymore, because there are all sorts of ways for businesses to make profit other than by trying to undercut people's actual labor value. There are all sorts of ways. Advertising, mass marketing, all these sorts of things that we see out there. But this is Marx's vision. So the more machines that gets purchased in these later stages of capitalism, the more machines that gets purchased, the fewer and fewer opportunities there are for employers to exploit their workers. So the workers are now unemployed, and the capitalists are making less and less actual profit because there's nobody to exploit. And so you now have this large pool. You have this huge section of the population that's unemployed, ready to revolt against these capitalist property owners who are actually not making any profit. And at that point, there's a revolution, and the workers of the world take the property from their capitalist bosses and apportion it among themselves. And that is a vision of system crisis, a system that that has internal structural problems, that is almost certainly not the actual system of the capitalist economy that we live in today. But the other assumption is that there is a substructure to society and a superstructure, and that the basis of society, that substructure, is the economy, and that this is the proper way to look at any social order. And Habermas is actually steering away from that now for something more nuanced, which is Parsons' way of looking at society. And in my later reading of Habermas, and some of the later chapters I've read through, it seems to me like Habermas is actually embracing a viewpoint where it's not just economic factors, it's not just political factors, it's not just social cultural factors that might lead to some sort of revolution in society, which is a systemic crisis. But it could come from any of those levels. So you have Marx, who's saying the economy is the fundamental thing. You have a philosopher like Aristotle, who believes that politics is the fundamental thing. He says that politics is the master science. And then you have sociocultural theorists, perhaps Adorno, perhaps Horkheimer and Adorno. No one is immediately coming to mind, but sociocultural patterns, perhaps postmodernist thinkers, as definitive for the identity of society. And when that identity changes, the society itself must change, would be the idea. But Habermas is now embracing a wider view where changes in any of those spheres could amount to a total change in the identity of society. So, with that, I think I have said enough for now, and I'll say goodnight.